Hello and welcome to Block 2. Here we're going to have a look at the targets and indicators in SDG 16. As you can see, there are 12 targets in SDG 16 and 24 indicators. This means that SDG 16 is one of the most populated of the SDGs in relation to number of targets and number of indicators. So here I'm going to review the extended report, which I'd like you to all to read through. I don't expect anyone to memorize any of the statistics or any of the data in it, but it would be great if you could have a look and familiarize yourself with the type of information and the kind of information that's contained in this, and maybe have a look at some of the trends and some of the sort of interesting features of the information that we can take. There are a number of surprising statistics in this. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to go through a number of the ones that I find most interesting. Let's start. So we're going to start with target 16.1. Significantly reduce all forms of violence and related deaths everywhere. The first indicator on this is 1.1, which is the number of victims of intentional homicide per 100,000 population by sex and age. And it starts out by saying that homicide rates are declining in most regions, but the gender disaggregated data highlights significant differences in progress between men and women across the region, and the data certainly backs that up. In terms of the numbers, it says that there's over 437,000 victims of homicide globally, and this means effectively that every hour there's about 50 people killed intentionally. The overwhelming majority of the homicides were male, 82%, with the remaining 18% being female. On the upside, between 2015 and 2020, the global rate of homicide declined by 5.2%. Another interesting statistic is that as of 2020, around 58% of all female homicides committed globally were perpetrated by intimate partners or other family members, people whom they would normally be expected to know or trust. In contrast, only 10% of male homicides were committed in the private sphere. Indicator 16.1.2, conflict-related deaths per 100,000 population by sex, age and cause. Significant loss of life and threats to civilians continue despite the decrease in the number of recorded conflict-related deaths in 2021. If you look at the statistics there is a very significant and good result there, that from 2015 to 2021 the number of deaths reduced there from just under 70,000 to just over 10,000, which is encouraging, but of course that's to do with all the conflicts that were ongoing at the time. The fluctuation in the number of civilian deaths seen in several armed conflicts since 2015 point to the continued and ongoing risks of escalation and associated violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law, as seen in early 2022. Unless and until armed conflicts are ended, they will continue to affect all segments of society and hit the most vulnerable the hardest. In 12 of the world's deadliest armed conflicts, the figures translate to 4.1 conflict-related deaths per 100,000 population, and 1 in 8 of those deaths was a woman or a child. The major cause of death there was small arms and light weapons, followed by heavy weapons and explosives. Indicator 16.1.3, proportion of population subjected to either physical violence, psychological violence, and or sexual violence in the previous 12 months. They don't give any statistics for this in the report, but you can look up some agencies if you want to find out more detailed statistics on it. They are, of course, quite difficult parameters to monitor. Indicator 16.1.4, proportion of the population that feels safe walking alone around the area they live after dark. This I find a very interesting set of statistics. So feeling unsafe in public can negatively influence well-being and hinder development. While perception of safety has remained quite stable at the global level over the past 6 years, women continue to feel significantly less safe compared to men when walking alone in the area in which they live after dark. Some interesting statistics there. Globally, the average is for men and women is 70% and 69% respectively of feeling safe around the world. A couple of statistics that surprised me a little were particularly Australia and New Zealand, that only 55 and 54% of people felt safe walking around at night. Interesting also that Eastern Asia and Southern Eastern Asia score higher than Europe and North America, although of course there are lots of places in both areas where it would be significantly more dangerous and less dangerous depending on where you were. And noticeably, consistently across the world, males in general feel safer when walking alone at night. So that's the end of the first four indicators associated with Target 16.1. Target 16.2 end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence against and torture of children. The indicators here, there isn't a lot of statistical data on any of them, but the indicators are proportion of children aged 1 to 17 who experienced any physical punishment and or psychological aggression by caregivers in the past month. You can see there that some agencies are listed, UNICEF in particular. Indicator 16.2.2, number of victims of human trafficking per 100,000 population by sex, age, and form of exploitation. And indicator 16.2.3, 18 to 29, who experienced sexual violence by the age of 18. I'm sure those statistics are being harvested, but not in this particular report, and I'm sure they are quite grim. Are you aware of trafficking or any issues like that going on in Ireland? Apparently there is quite an amount of illicit trafficking going on in Ireland, and there's a lot of efforts, of course, to stop that, but it is one of those things, I think, probably that gets swept under the carpet and not discussed perhaps as much as it should be. Target 16.3, promote the rule of law at national and international levels and ensure equal access to justice for all. Indicators here, 3.1, proportion of victims of violence in the previous 12 months who reported their victimization to competent authorities or other officially recognized conflict resolution mechanisms. Again, no statistics being given there, but they do give some statistics for the next indicator, which is unsentenced detainees as a proportion of overall prison population. I think that's a particularly telling and meaningful indicator. So it introduces it by saying in 2020, for the first time in the last 2 decades, there were significantly fewer persons held in detention worldwide compared to the previous year. However, the share of prisoners who are held in detention without being sentenced for a crime has remained. The reduction in the global number of prisons between 2019 and 2020 can be attributed to various reasons, including the emergency release of prisoners, which were implemented by most members following the outbreak of COVID-19, and reduced admission of new detainees due to court delays as a COVID measure, or reduced crime and or law enforcement activities during the lockdown. Interestingly, though, that despite the dramatic reduction in the global prison population recorded during the COVID pandemic, the share of prisoners who are held in detention without being sentenced for a crime, or the unsentenced detainees, has remained relatively unchanged at a global level. The third indicator in this target is 16.3.3, proportion of the population who have experienced a dispute in the past 2 years and who have access to formal or informal dispute resolution mechanism by type of mechanism. So again, they mention a number of custodian agencies who you might be able to get statistics from: the UNDP, the OECD, and the UNODC. So on to target 16.4 by 2030, significantly reduce illicit financial and arms flows, strengthen the recovery and return of stolen assets, and combat all forms of organised crime. The first indicator there, total value of inward and outward illicit financial flows in US dollars. They're not providing any stats on that, but they are on some stats on indicator 16.2, which is a portion of seized, found or surrendered arms whose illicit origin or context has been traced or established by competent authority in line with international instruments. Fortunately, that is one of the SDGs which isn't particularly applicable to Ireland, which is very fortunate. Up next, target 16.5, substantially reduce corruption and bribery in all their forms. A very important aspect of SDG 16. Number of indicators here, indicator 16.5.1, proportion of persons who had at least one contact with a public official who paid a bribe to a public official or were asked for a bribe by those public officials during the previous 12 months. No data here, and possibly this is to do with the fact that gathering information in relation to corruption is a difficult task, and you'll see in some of the later material a discussion on that and the issues around collecting information in relation to corruption and bribery. Indicator 16.5.2, Proportion of businesses that had at least one contact with a public official and that paid a bribe to a public official or were asked for a bribe by those public officials during the previous 12 months. So here they're trying to look at the proportion of businesses rather than persons. So they comment that corruption increases the cost of conducting business for entrepreneurs, and again, as I say, that will be referred to in some of the later material in this module. Globally, almost 1 in 6 businesses faced requests for bribe payments by public officials, 1 in 6. This is based on establishment-level surveys that collect data on what businesses experience on a day-to-day basis. The 6 transactions under consideration are obtaining electrical connections, water connections, construction-related permits, import licenses, operating licenses, and meeting with tax officials. The incidence of bribery varies across the world, of course. Target 16.6, develop effective, accountable and transparent institutions at all levels. First indicator there, 16.6.1, primary government expenditure as a proportion of original approved budget by sector, or budget codes are similar. So SDG 16.61 speaks how budgets are affected by the COVID pandemic. And there are a range of interesting statistics displayed there. One of the figures there shows the comparison of budget deviations before and during COVID, and you can see that in North America and Europe there was a bit of a jump there from 2015 to 2019 to the 2020-21 period. Obviously that was partially at least in response to the additional funding required for the COVID pandemic. Indicator 16.6.2, proportion of population satisfied with their last experience of public services. Again, no statistics supplied on this in this particular report. On to target 16.7, ensure responsive, inclusive, participatory and representative decision making at all levels. First indicator there, 16.7.1, proportions of positions in national and local institutions, including the legislature, the public services and the judiciary, compared to the national distribution by sex, age, persons with disabilities and population groups. Some interesting and indicative statistics here. Male parliamentarians aged 46 and above continue to dominate leadership positions in Parliament globally. And the first figure there shows 5 years in review. The proportion of women speakers and MPs in government from 2018 to 2022 increased from 23% and 17% for speakers and MPs respectively to 26 and 22%, so they went up between 3 and 5% over that period of time. But again, you're still talking pretty low statistics, between 22 and 26% of representatives in government positions or in elected positions being around between 22 and 26, but still a very low figure. And it comments again that male MPs aged 46 plus continue to dominate the parliamentary leadership posts. There's some more graphs there that illustrate this. In case you needed any more proof, there's 2 charts there that show that in relation to parliamentary leadership posts and speakers, 71.8% of them were males over 46, and in relation to other leadership posts and committee chairs, 60.5% of them were males over 46. It gives a number of other sources of information there. One good thing about this report is if you are using it for research, you will find that it does source or does reference where it gets its data from. The next indicator on that goal, on that target, is 16.7.2, proportion of population who believe decision making is inclusive and responsive by sex, age, disability and population group. Again, they don't have, or they're not reporting any data on that. We have another target here, 16.8, broaden and strengthen the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance. Indicator 16.8.1, proportion of members and voting rights of developing countries in international organizations. Again, they're not providing anything, but they do give 2 sources of potential information for that. 16.9, by 2030 provide legal identity for all, including birth registration, and the main indicator there, proportion of children under 5 whose births have been registered with a civil authority by age. Again, fortunately, it's one of those targets and indicators that isn't particularly relevant to Ireland. We've had good recording systems for many years. On to target 16.10, ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. So 16.10.1, the number of verified killings, kidnapping or enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention and torture of journalists, associated media personnel, trade unionists and human rights advocates in the previous 12 months. It's chilling and shocking to realise that these people are constantly killed and tortured and disappearing even in 2023 as we are now. Continued killings of human rights defenders, journalists and trade unionists mar rebuilding and recovery from the pandemic. That's one of the statements it makes there. I think it mars our ability to go forward and sustainably develop our planet in any way. According to the United Nations data, killing of human rights defenders, journalists and trade unionists have happened in over 1/3 of the UN member states from 2015 to 2021. So in over 1/3 of the member states there have been killings of people who are just trying to tell the truth and defend human rights. Over half of the human rights defenders killed or disappeared worldwide were leaders of peasant communities and land and environmental defenders. 2021 also saw an increase from 11% in 2020 to 16% in the proportion of women human rights defenders and journalists that were killed. The proportion of cases of killing of human rights defenders in the Latin American and Caribbean region compared to the global total has been steadily rising. The LAC, or as it's known, region now accounts for nearly 3 in 4 of the human rights defender killings, 74%. Globally, up from 1 in 2 in 2015. Just 3 countries in this region account for over 77% of globally recorded cases, so there's some serious problems in some of those countries. And another shocking statistic, there were 55 journalists killed in 2021 compared to 62 in 2020. Obviously that's an improvement, but the fact that there's 50 or 60 people killed globally on an annual basis for trying to report the truth is a shocking statistic. The next indicator we have there is 16.10.2, number of countries that adopt and implement constitutional, statutory and/or policy guarantees for public access to information. More countries have adopted legal frameworks on access to information, but some challenges remain in their implementation during the pandemic. So on to target 16A, or the 11th target. Strengthen relevant national institutions, including through international cooperation, for building capacity at all levels, in particular in developing countries, to prevent violence and combat terrorism and crime. The first indicator here is the existence of independent national human rights institutions in compliance with the Paris Principles. And they comment that decelerating progress in the number of independent NHRIs endangers rights-based pandemic recovery. Just to clarify there that NHRIs are national human rights institutions, and they are independent bodies mandated to promote and protect human rights. When in compliance with the Paris Principles, NHRIs are cornerstones of effective national human rights promotion and protection systems. Target 16.B, or Target 12, promote and enforce non-discriminatory laws and policies for sustainable development. Indicator 16.B.1, proportion of population reporting having personally felt discriminated against or harassed in the previous 12 months on the basis of grounds of discrimination prohibited under international human rights laws. And they comment that human rights must be at the heart of any transformative change to address intersecting discrimination exacerbated by the pandemic. And there's an interesting little graphic there. So that concludes my summary of the extended report for SDG 16. There are a lot more statistics in it than I have gone through there, but I think there are some of the key ones. I'd like you to have a look through it and maybe comment on which ones you think were interesting and why. And I look forward to seeing you in the next block. Thank you.